At 62, Clara Whitlock had $140 in her checking account, a rusted 1994 Ford pickup, and 7 years spent nursing her dying father, instead of renewing the nursing license she had let lapse. Her brothers split a $2.5 million lumber yard and a $3.4 million house between them, and Vance laughed out loud when the lawyer read what was left for her. 60 acres of Blackwater River bottomland, the county valued at $1,200, an old steam mill that had not turned a saw blade since the Eisenhower years, and an $840 tax lien to go with it. Garrett called it a swamp. Vance offered her $1,500 to walk away. Clara took the brass key on its leather thong instead and drove down to the river alone. Under the boiler kiln, one flagstone had been swept clean of 40 years of dust, the only clean stone in the room, and something her father had spent 4 decades hiding beneath it had never once been shown to his sons. The law office of Walter Webb sat on the second floor of the old red brick bank building on Colton's Main Street, up a narrow flight of hardwood stairs that groaned under every boot step. It smelled the way it had smelled since 1984, a mixture of lemon floor wax, heavy leather-bound state codes that nobody opened, unless they were trying to prove a neighbor wrong about a fence line, and the bitter, dark-roasted coffee Webb brewed in a dented aluminum percolator. He brewed it at 7 every morning and left it simmering on the hot plate until 5 in the evening. Clara Whitlock sat in the middle of 3 green vinyl chairs facing Webb's walnut desk. She was 62 years old, her graying hair pulled back in a neat utilitarian knot. Wearing a faded canvas barn coat over a flannel shirt and a pair of sturdy leather work boots, she had oiled twice that November to keep the mountain slush out. Her hands, resting quietly in her lap, were not the soft hands of a woman who spent her afternoons in tea rooms or beauty parlors. They were strong, calloused hands, marked by the tiny white scars of rose thorns, pruning shears, and the rough grain of unfinished lumber. They were the hands of a daughter who had spent the last 7 years lifting an old man out of bed, measuring his insulin, tending his wood stove, and sitting beside him through the long, quiet nights while his breath grew as thin as winter smoke. To Clara's left sat her oldest brother, Garrett. He was 65, dressed in a charcoal wool coat he had bought on a business trip to Atlanta, his silver hair trimmed every 12 days by a barber who charged $40 a visit. He spent most of his time checking his smartphone, his thumb flicking across the glass screen with an impatient, rhythmic tap. To her right sat her younger brother, Vance, 58, wearing a heavy leather jacket that smelled of expensive cologne and new car interior. Vance had his ankles crossed, his designer boots extended toward Webb's desk, like a man who already owned the floorboards beneath them. Neither brother had looked Clara in the eye since they had stepped out of their separate sport utility vehicles in the bank parking lot below. When they had met on the sidewalk outside, Garrett had offered a brief, flat nod, and Vance had said it was a cold morning and hoped she had found a spot for her old truck. That was all. There had been no embrace, no shared word about the funeral. 3 days earlier, no inquiry into how she was sleeping after 7 years of living on a schedule dictated by their father's oxygen tanks and medication alarms. Behind the desk, Walter Webb adjusted his bifocals. He was 71, thin as a cedar fence post, with eyebrows like gray thistle and a voice that had been trained across 40 years of probate hearings never to rise, never to fall, and never to apologize for what a dead man had decided to do with his own labor. He told them they were there to execute the last will and testament of Arthur Thomas Whitlock, recorded in his office on the 15th day of October, 4 years ago. He stated that Arthur was of sound mind, clear memory, and specific intent, and that he would read the provisions exactly as they were dictated. Garrett stopped tapping his phone, slid it into his breast pocket, and folded his arms, while Vance leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his jaw tight. Webb held the stiff cream-colored paper up to the desk lamp and read the first bequest. To his eldest son, Garrett Arthur Whitlock, Arthur left the entirety of Whitlock Commercial Lumber and Supply, including the main distribution yard on Highway 4, the timber handling equipment, the rolling stock of transport trucks, the commercial inventory currently on site, and all corporate bank accounts attached to the operating name. The will noted that Garrett had always wanted the sign with the family name on it and charged him not to dishonor it. Garrett let out a slow, satisfied breath through his nose. He did not smile, being too practiced in corporate boardrooms for that, but his shoulders dropped an inch. The commercial yard on Highway 4 was a front-facing juggernaut in Colton County, handling wholesale lumber for every tract home developer within 70 miles, worth on paper and equipment alone better than $2.5 million. Webb continued to the second bequest, reading with a dry rustle of paper. To his second son, Vance Robert Whitlock, Arthur left the family residence on Ridge Road, the 12 acres of surrounding residential pasture, the household furnishings, and the personal investment accounts held at Colton National Bank, amounting to the sum of $3,412,000 as of the date of the writing. The text reminded Vance that he had always measured a man by the size of his roof and wished that it would keep the rain off his head. Vance shifted in his chair, a faint, closed-mouth grin touching the corner of his lip as he looked across Clara toward Garrett. The two brothers exchanged a single, knowing glance that lasted less than half a second. The look of men who had done the math weeks ago and found the numbers exactly to their liking. Webb did not look up. He cleared his throat once with a small, dry scrape and turned to the final sheet of paper. To his daughter, Clara May Whitlock, who stayed when the house was quiet, who knew the names of his trees, and who never asked for a single dollar he did not earn with his own hands, Arthur left parcel 14. This comprised 60 acres of bottomland at the Oxbow bend of the Blackwater River, together with the old steam mill structure, the boiler kiln, the tender's cabin, and everything standing, buried, or resting upon it, with an appraised value for tax purposes of $1,200 and an outstanding county back tax lien of $840 to be assumed by the beneficiary. The office went silent save for the clank of the steam pipes in the corner. Vance let out a short, incredulous laugh and rubbed the back of his neck, muttering that their father really had lost his grip at the end, to leave her an old swamp bend down by the trestle. Garrett's tone carried the practiced restraint of an older brother who wanted to appear magnanimous after winning the lottery. He turned toward Clara, his face composed into a mask of solemn, condescending pity, and told her that everyone knew their father had been difficult those last few years and that his mind was not what it used to be. He reminded her that the bottomland had been underwater half the springs since the 70s, that the old steam mill had not turned a saw blade since the Eisenhower administration, and that the county had been threatening to condemn the kiln for a decade. Clara said nothing, keeping her eyes fixed on Walter Webb, who looked back at her over the silver rims of his glasses, with eyes that were steady and entirely devoid of the pity her brothers were radiating. Vance reached into his jacket, pulled out a leather checkbook, and said, "It was not right to leave her with an $800 tax lien on a piece of condemned mud after she had spent so much time out at the house with their father." He offered to give her $1,500 right then for the scrap rights. Claiming there was probably some old iron in the boiler room they could haul to the smelter in Murfreesboro, and that he could use the bottomland to dump clean fill from the Ridge Road excavation. He clicked a gold-plated pen and dangled it over the check, telling her that $1,500 would clear her tax debt and put $600 cash in her pocket to help her settle into an apartment in town. Clara stood up at the measured, deliberate pace of an old man's breath, having no intention of hurrying for two men who had visited their father 4 times in 3 years, and always on Sundays when the banks were closed. She told Vance in a low, clear voice to put his checkbook away, because she did not need his $600. Garrett stood up beside her, frowning as he buttoned his coat, and warned her not to be stubborn. He reminded her that as an executor on the estate he had reviewed her balances and knew she had only $140 in her personal checking account, an old truck with a rusted bed, and no retirement fund because she had let her nursing license lapse 30 years ago to care for their father. He asked her how she expected to pay the property taxes on a condemned swamp. Clara reached out her right hand toward Walter Webb's desk. The lawyer opened his top center drawer and laid a small heavy object on the worn green blotter. It was a notched brass key, 4 inches long, its square bow worn smooth and dark by decades of thumb grease and pocket carry, threaded onto a braided leather thong that had been rubbed until it was soft as velvet. Beside it lay an old, heavy leather-backed pocket ledger with a rubber band wrapped 3 times around its middle. Clara picked up the key and the ledger, slipping the leather thong over her head so the brass key rested cold against the collar of her flannel shirt, and tucking the ledger under her arm. She looked her older brother straight in his comfortable gray eyes and told him that their father had not left her a debt, but rather what he thought she was suited for. She reminded him that he got the name on the sign, Vance got the house on the hill, and she got the river. She turned to Walter Webb and thanked him, asking if there were any other papers she needed to sign that day. Webb stood up and extended his long, dry hand across the desk, giving her calloused fingers a single, firm press that in Colton County meant a contract was sealed before God and the county clerk. He told her there was not a single paper more to sign, explaining that the deed to Parcel 14 had been transferred to her name by irrevocable right of survivorship 3 years earlier and was recorded in Book 42 at the courthouse. He told her she did not owe Garrett or Vance an explanation, a signature, or the time of day. When Garrett flushed red and protested his authority as primary executor, Webb sat back down and pulled his coffee percolator toward him, reminding Garrett that his jurisdiction covered only the commercial holdings and liquid accounts. He advised the brothers to sign their account receipts so he could attend to an 11 o'clock appointment with a widow who did not care to wait on men who complained about their blessings. Clara did not wait to hear her brother's reply. She walked to the door, her leather work boots heavy and honest on the pine floorboards, opened it, and went down the narrow stairs into the November air. The air outside smelled of wood smoke from the bakery down the block and the cold, damp iron of an approaching mountain drizzle. Clara walked 2 blocks down Main Street to where she had parked her 1994 Ford F-150, a long bed truck, the color of river clay. It had a dent in the driver's side fender from an encounter with a stubborn cedar post in 2008, and a tailgate that required 2 specific thumps, with the heel of a hand to latch properly. Sitting upright in the passenger seat, his gray-muzzled chin resting on the windowsill, was Barnaby. Barnaby was an 11-year-old German Shepherd mix with one ear that stood straight up and one that tipped forward like a folded leaf. Arthur had found him as a shivering, 6-week-old pup, abandoned in a ditch along Highway 4 during a November freezing rain. He had carried him home inside his wool coat and had never gone 50 yards without the dog at his heel since. When the funeral directors had come to the house on Ridge Road to carry Arthur out, Barnaby had walked as far as the gravel driveway, stopped, and looked at Clara. He had not gone back inside the big house again, but had climbed into the passenger side of Clara's Ford and stayed there. Clara opened the door, and Barnaby shifted his weight, his tail giving 3 slow, heavy thumps against the vinyl seat cover as he nuzzled her elbow. She scratched the thick, graying fur behind his upright ear and told him it was just the 2 of them and 60 acres of mud now. She turned the key, and the old 300 cubic inch inline 6 engine turned over twice, coughed once, and settled into its steady low RPM rumble, an engine that did not know how to go fast but refused to understand how to die. She pulled out onto the road and turned south, away from the paved commercial districts and the sprawling brick homes of Ridge Road, heading down toward the valley floor, where the Blackwater River cut its long, winding loop through the hardwood timber of the lower hills. 6 miles out of town, the pavement ended, and the road turned to packed gravel and river shale, running parallel to the water beneath a canopy of towering sycamores, white oaks, and shagbark hickories whose leaves had already turned the color of old copper and fallen to carpet the ditches. 2 miles further down, where the river made a sharp horseshoe turn against a limestone bluff, A rusted iron gate blocked a twin-rutted wagon trail that disappeared into the timber. A wooden sign, its white paint peeled away, until only the faint, weathered indentations of hand-carved letters remained, hung from an overhead beam, marking the property as the Whitlock Mill, established in 1891. Clara stopped the truck, left the engine idling, and walked up to the gate where a heavy iron padlock, green with verdigris and pitted by 40 years of river mist, held the chain wrapped around the cedar post. Her brothers had probably never touched this lock in their lives. Viewing the mill as a ghost story, viewing the mill, where their grandfather had lost 2 fingers to a planer belt in 1934, and where their father had spent his Saturday mornings getting covered in sawdust and grease instead of taking them to country club luncheons. Clara took the 4-inch brass key in her hand and slid it into the keyhole. When decades of internal grit held the tumblers fast, she did not force it, but drew the key back a 1/4 inch, blew into the rusted barrel, and applied a steady, even pressure with her thumb, the way her father had taught her to coax an old nut off a bolt without stripping the thread. With a dry, metallic clack, the tongue of the padlock slid back, and the chain fell into the wet gravel with a heavy rattle. She pushed the gate open, its rusted hinges shrieking across the silence of the woods with a long, echoing cry that bounced off the limestone bluff across the river and sent a pair of wood ducks lifting off the water with a flurry of whistling wings. She drove the truck down the trail, the branches of overgrown sumac and witch hazel brushing along the doors like hands reaching out to check who had come back. At the end of the trail, the woods opened into a 5-acre clearing along the riverbank where the mill stood. It was an immense, 3-story post and beam structure, built from 16-inch hand-hewn white oak timbers, its exterior walls clad in rough-sawn cypress boards that had weathered over a century to the silvery gray of a hornet's nest. Its slate roof, laid by her great-grandfather in the year Grover Cleveland was president, was still arrow straight, without a sag in the ridge line, or a single slate missing. Against the south face of the building stood the boiler kiln, a 40-foot square brick structure with a 50-foot chimney that rose above the surrounding sycamores like a brick watchtower. 50 yards away, nestled on a slight rise above the flood mark under 3 massive walnut trees, sat the mill tender's cabin, 20 feet by 30, built of dovetailed heart pine logs, with a full-length front porch facing the river. Clara parked the truck in the clearing and shut off the engine, letting the silence of the bottomland come flooding back, big and cool, broken only by the steady, cold murmur of the Blackwater River 30 yards away, and the wind moving through the dry cornstalks in the neighbor's upper field a half-mile off. Barnaby dropped out of the truck cab, his nose immediately dropping to the dirt as he trotted across the clearing, sniffing along the stone foundation of the mill and the base of the brick kiln before running straight to the front porch of the cabin, where he sat on the top step and gave a single, short bark. Clara carried her cardboard box of groceries and her father's brass lantern from the truck bed up the porch steps, telling the dog she knew his master's scent was still there. She pressed the thumbpiece of the wrought iron latch, and the oak cabin door swung inward without a scrape on its silent, leather-greased hinges. Inside, the cabin held that deep, preserved stillness of a room that has not held a breath since the last leaves fell, cold but entirely dry, with no smell of rot, mildew, or animal droppings. The floor was made of wide plank chestnut, scrubbed with lye until the grains stood out like relief maps of rivers. In the center of the main room sat a black cast-iron cook stove, its chimney pipe rising through a soapstone collar in the ceiling, while along the west wall ran a built-in bunk with a clean straw tick mattress and 2 heavy wool blankets folded square at the foot. On the scrubbed pine table under the north window sat an oil lamp filled to the brim with clean kerosene, beside a single wooden matchbox, with 1 match protruding slightly from the tray. Clara struck the match against the side of the box and touched the flame to the lamp wick, sending a warm, golden light across the chestnut floor that caught the grain of the logs and the polished brass of an old barometer hanging by the door. She walked over to the wood box beside the stove, finding it stacked to the top edge, with 18-inch splits of shagbark hickory, seasoned for at least 7 years until the bark was dry as tinder and smelled of faint vanilla and old smoke. Her father had cut this wood and stacked it there when his hands were still strong enough to swing a 6-pound splitting maul, before emphysema had started turning his lips blue after 20 paces. She built a fire, laying 3 knots of fatwood on the grate, crossing 2 splits of hickory over them, and touching the flame until the cast iron was snapping and pinging with heat. And the chimney was drawing with a low, authoritative roar that smelled of clean hardwood and mountain winter. She made coffee in a blue enamel pot she had brought from her truck, hauling cold water from the stone-lined well behind the cabin, measuring 3 scoops of coarse ground coffee, and setting the pot on the corner of the stove, where the iron was just hot enough to simmer without boiling. By 6 o'clock, the light outside had gone purple, then slate gray, then black, and the steady, quiet mountain mist had settled into the trees, making the rest of the world feel 10,000 miles away. Clara sat in the wooden rocking chair by the stove with a mug of coffee in her hand, her boots off, and her wool-socked feet resting on the iron fender, while Barnaby lay stretched out across the rug at her feet in a long, deep sleep. She opened the pocket ledger Walter Webb had given her. The cover was stiff black oilcloth, the edges frayed until the white linen threads showed like whiskers, and the pages inside were ruled in faded blue ink and filled from margin to margin with Arthur Whitlock's handwriting. It was not the hurried scrawl of a man who did not care, but the small, precise, architect square printing of a timberman who had spent 60 years measuring lumber down to the 32nd of an inch. The first entry was dated April 12, 1981, recording that the river had dropped 3 feet after the spring thaw, allowing him to locate 3 16-foot virgin cypress logs in the oxbow pool 12 feet down in the silt. The entry noted that the bark was intact, the heartwood solid as iron, and that the logs had been raised with a hand winch and 2 mules and hauled to the lower kiln pit. Clara turned the pages slowly, realizing that for 40 years, while Garrett was away at business school learning how to leverage loans, and Vance was buying his first sport boat, their father had been spending his Sundays, holidays, and quiet evenings down in the mud of the Blackwater River. Every page was a meticulous record of salvage. An entry from October 14, 1993, detailed sinker log number 114. It was a black walnut 28 inches in diameter at the butt and 14 feet long, felled during the 1888 harvest by the old mountain cruise, and lost off the barge at the horseshoe turn. It had heavy curly figure, 0 rot, and was cured in kiln chamber 4. Another entry from August 9, 2004, recorded sinker log number 289, a 20-foot virgin heart pine 24 inches square hewn that had sunk in the gravel trench below the trestle for 120 years. Its resin had crystallized into amber, and its annual rings numbered 300 per inch. Clara stopped reading and looked at the dates, understanding with absolute clarity that Arthur Whitlock had never been senile or holding on to a condemned swamp out of foolish sentimentality. While his sons were building a modern commercial lumber yard that sold soft, fast-grown pine from clear-cut plantations that warped and rotted after 10 years in the weather, their father had been quietly locating, raising, and curing the lost harvest of the 19th century. He had been harvesting the sinker logs, the massive old-growth timber that had sunk to the bottom of the Blackwater River during the great log drives of the 1880s and the 1890s. The logs had been preserved by the cold, oxygen-free silt until the wood was denser, richer, and more beautifully figured than anything standing in an American forest today. And he had left every single inch of it to her. The next morning broke clear and sharp at 38 degrees, with a low white river fog hanging 3 feet off the water like a wool blanket set out to dry. Clara dressed in her barn coat, pulled on her oiled boots, and stepped out onto the porch with a fresh cup of coffee. Barnaby was already down in the yard, his ears forward, and his nose working the damp air coming off the river. He did not run toward the trees, but trotted straight across the wet gravel toward the north door of the brick boiler kiln, and stood there, looking back at her, over his shoulder, with a sharp, insistent woof. Clara set her mug on the porch railing and walked across the clearing to see what her father had kept stored in the kiln house. The boiler kiln was built of soft red river brick, its walls 3 feet thick to hold the heat of the steam fires, and its entrance was a pair of heavy, iron-bound white oak doors secured by a sliding iron drawbar. Clara lifted the bar, which slid back with a heavy greased slide, and pulled the doors open to reveal an interior scent unlike any smell in the world. There was 70 years of dry wood sawdust, old steam cylinder oil, tallow, dried leather belting, and the faint, sweet aroma of cured walnut and cedar. In the center of the main floor sat the heart of the mill, a 1904 Atlas side-crank steam engine with a 12-foot cast-iron flywheel standing 20 feet tall, its copper oil cups and brass steam gauges still polished to a dull, dignified gold. Beside it sat the boiler itself, a 20-foot iron cylinder bricked into a kiln bed, its firebox doors cast with the words Atlas Engine Works, Indianapolis, 1904. Everything was cold, but nothing was rusted. Every grease cup was full. Every gear tooth was coated in a protective layer of beeswax and tallow, and the great leather drive belt, 4 inches wide and 40 feet long, was rolled neatly into a coil and hung from an overhead beam away from the damp. Barnaby trotted around the back of the brick firebox into the narrow, shadowed space between the boiler brickwork and the rear limestone wall of the kiln house, where he dropped his nose to the stone flagging on the floor and began to scratch with his right front paw in a steady, deliberate scrape. Clara walked around the brickwork and examined the floor, which was laid with large rectangular flags of river limestone fitted together without mortar. She noticed that one flagstone right at the center of the wall, where the warmth from the firebox would have kept the stone dry for 100 years, was clean of the fine gray sawdust that coated the rest of the floor. It looked as if someone had swept around the seam with a whisk broom within the last year. In the corner of the room stood her father's heavy pine toolbox with rope handles, from which she took a 3-foot crowbar made of hand-forged hexagonal steel with a sharp, bright wedge end. She knelt on the cold limestone, slipped the wedge edge into the seam of the clean flagstone, and leaned her weight against the steel until the stone shifted with a deep, earthy thud. She slid a piece of firewood under the raised edge to hold it, got a 2-handed grip on the stone, and lifted it clear. Underneath was a pit 3 feet square and 2 feet deep, lined with dry cedar boards to keep the river moisture out. In the bottom of the pit sat a World War II-era military footlocker made of olive drab steel, its brass latches sealed with heavy red paraffin wax. While Barnaby sat on his haunches watching her, Clara used the tip of her pocket knife to crack the wax seals, unclipped the brass latches, and lifted the lid. Inside lay 3 things arranged, with the mathematical neatness of a man who never left a tool out of its place. First was a bundle of 4 field journals bound in black oilcloth and numbered on their spines in white paint. From Volume 1, covering 1968 to 1978, through Volume 4, covering 2003 to 2019. Second was a flat, heavy tin document box, tied with a red cloth ribbon, the kind old farmers used to keep their fire insurance deeds in. Third, resting on top of the tin box, was her father's master grafting and marking knife. Clara picked up the knife first, feeling the weight of its 4-inch blade forged from high-carbon tool, steel honed thin as silver wire. Its handle was made of dark, tiger-striped curly walnut her father had carved himself in the winter of 1974, with his initials inlaid in small brass pins near the bolster. She had seen him use this knife 1,000 times to mark log lengths in the woods or slice apples on the porch, before he had cleaned it with oil, wrapped it in a handkerchief, and put it away when his hands began to tremble in his 78th year. She untied the red ribbon on the tin document box and lifted the lid to find a neat stack of pale blue and tan Series E savings bonds in $50, $100, and $500 denominations, dated between 1972 and 1998. Every single one was issued to Arthur T. Whitlock and payable on death to Clara May Whitlock. An index card clipped to the top of the stack, in her father's square hand, noted that the total redemption value, at full maturity, in 2018 was $68,400. It was left for Clara, so she would never have to ask her brothers for the price of a load of wood or a bag of flour. Beneath the bonds lay a folded sheet of yellow legal paper, written in black fountain pen ink. In the letter, Arthur told Clara that if she was reading his words down at the mill with Barnaby, then Walter Webb had done his job. He wrote that he knew what Garrett and Vance thought of the place and had let them think it, because a man who only respects what he can see in a bank ledger will never understand what lives under the water. He explained that Garrett viewed timber as weeds to be cut down fast for houses that would not last 40 years, while Vance viewed money as a tool to make other men feel small. He wrote that neither he nor their mother could teach those boys differently, because their eyes were turned toward shiny things. Clara was different. She had sat on the porch at 9 years old, watching him hand-scrape a walnut tabletop for 6 weeks, without ever asking why he didn't not just buy a can of varnish from the hardware store. He explained that the 60 acres of Parcel 14 were not a swamp, but the old log-holding boom for the entire Blackwater River Valley from 1880 to 1910, where the mountain camps caught their timber drives in the Oxbow Bend right out in front of the cabin. He wrote that in 40 years of driving timber, more than 500 old-growth logs had sunk in that bend because the wood was too heavy and dense with resin and heartwood to float. They settled into 20 feet of cold river silt, where they rested without oxygen, worms, or rot, while the world above forgot what real wood looked like. He told her he had spent his life pulling them up, refusing to let Garrett cut 20-foot virgin heart pine into 2x4s for suburban garages. Instead, he had cured them in a drying vault built into the limestone bluff behind the kiln house, where the temperatures stayed 54 degrees year-round. He instructed her never to sell it cheap or let her brothers touch a splinter of it, because it was the last of the real forest and belonged to her. He added a final note to take care of Barnaby and give him an egg over his dry food on Sundays. Clara folded the yellow paper and sat on the cold limestone floor of the boiler house, holding the Damascus marking knife and the savings bonds while the November sun broke through the sycamores to cast long golden bars of light through the open oak doors. She did not cry, knowing Arthur Whitlock would not have wanted tears over a clean toolbox and a job well done. She took Barnaby's head between her hands, pressed her forehead against his upright ear, and told him they had work to do. Clara spent the rest of that Tuesday morning sitting at the pine table in the cabin with the 4 black ledgers spread open before her, while the wood stove hummed with a fresh load of hickory. Her father had drawn a complete scale hydrographic map of the Oxbow Bend using an old surveyor's transit and a lead line, charting the bottom of the Blackwater River from the gravel bar at the north trestle down to the limestone bluff at the south turn. Every submerged log was marked on the map, with a small numbered circle cross-referenced to the ledger pages. Logs 1 through 142 were stored in the North Bluff Vault, identified as virgin white cypress, averaging 18 feet in length and 30 inches in diameter, impervious to water or insects, and suited for boat hulls or cathedral carving. Logs 143 through 280 were stored in the South Bluff Vault, identified as black walnut and curly walnut, felled from the old cove forests in 1885, possessing exceptional flame and fiddleback figure with 0 sapwood, suited for instrument backs and heritage casework. Logs 281 through 410 were stored in the Central Kiln Vault, identified as longleaf virgin heart pine, with 20 annual rings per inch and crystallized amber resin, weighing 64 pounds per cubic foot, and ringing like a cast-iron bell when struck with a hammer. 75 additional logs, numbered 411 through 485, were noted as currently secured by chain to the underwater gravel ledge in 10 feet of water, ready for winching. Clara stood up and took the brass key ring from around her neck, selecting a smaller key forged of dark iron with a hollow pipe barrel that hung beside the 4-inch cabin key. She walked out of the cabin with Barnaby at her heels and followed the narrow gravel path around the rear of the brick kiln house to the base of the limestone bluff that rose 50 feet above the river valley. Hidden behind a thick, woven wall of wild grapevine and climbing ivy was an iron door 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, set directly into the natural rock face of the hill. It was built like an 1870s brewery lagering cave door, made from heavy boilerplate iron hung on 2-inch steel pintles set into lead-poured holes in the rock. Clara pulled the ivy aside, inserted the hollow barrel iron key into the lock plate, stamped E.G. Smalley, locksmith, Cincinnati, and turned it twice to the right and turned it twice to the right until the heavy internal deadbolts dropped with a sound like a rifle shot. She pulled the handle, and the door swung outward to release a cool, sweet, dry draft of air that smelled of crushed limestones, cedar shavings, and the unmistakable rich perfume of centuries-old timber. She stepped inside, with her brass lantern raised, entering a natural cavern, 30 feet wide and 80 feet deep that her grandfather and father had squared up with handpicks and timber shoring. Its floor was covered in 6 inches of clean pea gravel that absorbed every drop of condensation. Thousands of board feet of lumber were stacked from the floor to the 15-foot ceiling in perfect stickered rows, with 1-inch dry oak strips between every board to let the cool air circulate. The lumber was sawn to 2, 3, and 4-inch thicknesses, their ends coated in wax to prevent checking and their faces planed just enough to reveal the figure within. Clara held the lantern close to a stack of walnut boards near the entrance, watching how the wood seemed to burn from the inside out with a deep, shimmering violet-black color crossed by tight, undulating waves of fiddleback curl that shifted to old gold as she moved the light. She walked further into the vault to inspect the virgin heart pine. Stacks of planks 20 feet long, 12 inches wide, and 3 inches thick, without a single knot or twist from one end to the other. It was so dense with amber resin that when she rapped her knuckle against a board end, the entire stack vibrated with a clear musical hum. She knew that 30 years earlier, a violin maker from Philadelphia had handed her father $1,200 in cash for a single walnut plank from this stock, with tears in his eyes for the privilege of buying it. In that dry limestone cave sat better than 70,000 board feet of the rarest artisan timber in North America. It was worth between $3 and $4 million on the open market to luthiers, restoration architects, custom furniture masters, and yacht designers, with 75 more logs waiting out in the river silt. She stepped back out into the sunlight, locked the heavy iron door, let the wild grapevines fall back across the metal, and told Barnaby they needed to go see Hank Mercer. Clara did not drive to Colton National Bank to cash her bonds, or call a timber broker in Atlanta. She knew that the moment a Whitlock tried to move $4 million of rare lumber through a commercial broker, Garrett's corporate lawyers would file injunctions at the county courthouse before the ink was dry. Instead, she drove 3 miles up the valley road to the crossroads community of High Bridge, a cluster of 6 clapboard houses, a cinderblock Baptist church, and Mercer's Hardware and Agricultural Supply. Hank Mercer was 64 years old, a retired Navy Seabee who had spent 20 years keeping diesel engines and steam generators running in waist-deep mud, before returning to Colton County in 1995 to buy the Crossroads hardware store. When Clara walked through the screen door, Hank set down a box of brass plumbing fittings, came around the long oak counter, took her by both shoulders, and told her he had sat in the back row at Arthur's funeral to stay clear of Garrett's country club crowd. When Clara explained that her brothers had taken the commercial lumber business, the Ridge Road estate, and the bank accounts, leaving her only parcel 14, Hank's weathered face broke into a slow, understanding smile as he caught sight of the brass key on her leather thong and Arthur's Damascus marking knife on her belt. He called Arthur an absolute mountain fox, revealing that he had been ordering 4-inch leather drive belts from St. Louis for her father every 10 years. He had also used his Dodge winch truck to help raise log number 312 out of the bottom hole back in 1988. keeping his mouth shut about the limestone bluff ever since. When Clara asked for steam cylinder oil for the Atlas engine, 50 feet of 3/4-inch Manila hemp rope, a 10-inch flat mill file for the circular saw teeth, 5 gallons of kerosene, and 2 sacks of dry mortar to repoint the frost-popped north face of the kiln chimney, Hank immediately began writing on a yellow receipt pad. He told her he had authentic 600-weight steam cylinder tallow in the back shed, but insisted that repointing a 50-foot chimney required a bosun's chair and help. He declared that on Wednesday at noon, he would close the shop and bring old Cyrus Miller, a 75-year-old retired furniture factory steam boiler operator, along with 2 hydraulic bottle jacks and boiler tube brushes to fire the Atlas up. When Clara reached for an envelope of $50 savings bonds to pay for the supplies, Hank ordered her to put her money away. He said, in his absolute CB register, that Arthur had given him 25 board feet of dry heart pine in 1998 to build kitchen cabinets after a house fire, and had refused to take a dime. He warned her that, if she tried to pay him for kerosene and rope, he would throw her out of the store and let Barnaby bite his leg. By 1 o'clock on Wednesday, the clearing at the Oxbow Bend was transformed as Hank Mercer's 1-ton Dodge flatbed, parked beside the brick kiln house next to a rusted 1988 Chevrolet station wagon belonging to Cyrus Miller. Cyrus, a wiry old man in faded striped overalls and a blue engineer's cap, walked straight into the boiler room without a word and laid his hand against the cold iron flywheel of the Atlas engine. He declared that he had not seen an oil cup grease box like that since his father's mill in 1946. By 2 o'clock, a third car arrived, an old Buick driven by Mabel Gentry, a 68-year-old widow who had run the Crossroads Diner for 40 years. She knew that 3 old men and 1 woman working in a November River bottom needed half a smoked country ham, 2 dozen buttermilk biscuits, a gallon of hot sweet tea, and 3 jars of apple butter. For the next 2 weeks, the Oxbow Bend came alive with the sounds of working-class resurrection, free of corporate contractors or hard-hatted men looking at spreadsheets. Cyrus Miller worked on his back inside the brick firebox, his overalls covered in 70 years of wood soot, as he scraped the boiler flues with a steel wire brush until the iron rang clean. Hank Mercer hung 50 feet up the chimney stack in a rope harness, packing fresh lime mortar into the frost seams with a steady clink of his trowel. On the saw floor above, Clara stood at the 60-inch circular saw carriage with a 10-inch mill file in her hand. She hand-filed each of the 54 inserted teeth at a precise 35-degree bevel, without using a power grinder that would heat and soften the old tool steel. Her strokes were smooth, rhythmic, and patient, sending tiny silver curls of steel dropping onto the chestnut timber of the carriage frame, while Barnaby supervised from the porch steps or the sawdust floor. On the 3rd Saturday of November, a cold, crisp morning with white frost on the dead grass, Cyrus Miller stepped out of the kiln house door and wiped his hands on a greasy red rag. He announced that the boiler was full from the well tank. The flues were clean, the safety valve was weighted to 120 pounds, and dry hickory was stacked in the firebox. When Clara gave the order to light it, Cyrus struck a wooden match against his thumbnail, held it to a twist of oil-soaked burlap in the firebox draft, and closed the heavy iron door. After 10 minutes of crackling wood and the hollow roar of the chimney drawing cold air, the needle on the brass steam gauge above the firebox began to move. It rose steadily past 20 and 50 pounds until it reached 80, at which point Cyrus opened the cylinder drain cocks and pulled the main throttle lever down 3 inches. With a long, shuddering hiss of white steam that shot 10 feet out into the November air, the great 12-foot cast-iron flywheel of the Atlas engine moved an inch, stopped, moved 6 inches, and then settled into its stroke as the grease in the bearings warmed, and the tallow melted into the brass channels. The rhythm sounded like the heartbeat of the river valley, chug-hiss, chug-hiss. As the 40-foot leather drive belt tightened, and the 16-inch white oak timbers of the mill building gave a resonant groan. On the saw floor above, the 60-inch circular saw blade began to spin. turning faster until the steel hummed with a clear, high silver note that sang across the Blackwater River and bounced off the limestone bluff. They did not start their milling with an ordinary log, but used the overhead gear reduction hand winch to hoist log number 114 out of the lower water trough, where Clara had soaked it to wash away the river grit. It was a black walnut log, 28 inches across the butt and 14 feet long, weighing better than 2,000 pounds. It had been cut by hand with a crosscut saw in 1888 and had rested in the dark silt of the oxbow bend for 135 years. Clara set the iron dogs into the bark to hold the log fast against the carriage headblocks, stepped up to the polished hickory sawyer's lever that controlled the friction drive, and checked that Hank Mercer was ready at the off-bearer's table with a timber hook. When Clara pushed the hickory lever forward, the carriage moved down the track with a steady, heavy gait, carrying the great walnut log toward the spinning 60-inch blade. The high-carbon inserted teeth met the wood without a scream of protest, smoke, or binding, shearing into the ancient heartwood with a deep, authoritative rumble that shook the soles of her boots through 2 inches of oak flooring. A fountain of fine, heavy chocolate-colored sawdust arsed into the air and showered down into the pit below as the carriage cleared the blade and the outer slab fell away onto the conveyor rolls. When Clara misted the freshly cut surface with water from an old brass spray bottle, Hank Mercer stepped close and let out a low whistle. He marveled at the deep, shimmering violet-black heartwood, crossed by tight undulating waves of fiddleback curl, with growth rings barely thicker than a human hair. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, they had sawn the 14-foot log into 8 flawless, 3-inch thick cants, 24 inches wide, stacking them on the loading dock with dry oak stickers and warm paraffin wax brushed onto the ends. 4 days later, a navy blue Mercedes-Benz transport van with out-of-state plates drove down the gravel river trail and parked beside Clara's Ford. 2 men stepped out. Julian Vance was the 60-year-old senior buyer and restoration consultant for the Heritage Instrument Works in Nashville until 6 in the morning. And Robert Henderson was a 70-year-old master furniture maker from Asheville whose hand-carved tables sold for $50,000 in Atlanta galleries. Hank Mercer had made a single phone call to a Dulcimer Building Navy buddy in Knoxville, and within 48 hours, the 2 most respected buyers of specialty hardwood in the South had driven 4 hours to the Blackwater River Valley. Clara met them on the cabin porch in her work boots and flannel shirt, telling them to leave their checkbooks in the van until they had inspected the grain in the bluff vault. For 45 minutes inside the limestone cave, neither buyer spoke a word out loud. The only sounds were the beep of their digital moisture meters against the wood, the scraping of pocket knives clearing wax off board ends, and the sharp inhalations of breath from men who believed wood of that quality had vanished from the earth 80 years ago. Julian Vance walked out into the sunlight, wiped his spectacles with a trembling hand, and told Clara that in 1994 he had paid $1,200 a board foot for Pennsylvania curly walnut that had wormholes and sapwood. He stated that her cave held 20,000 board feet of fiddleback walnut with 0 sapwood, 0 insect damage, and an 8% moisture content, stabilized by 30 years of natural cave curing. He offered $65 board foot for 20 boards, totaling 700 board feet, payable immediately by certified bank draft at $45,500. Clara held firm at $70 a foot, stipulating that they employ local high bridge labor at $20 an hour to load the van without bruising the edges. Julian Vance smiled with genuine warmth and shook her hand to seal the deal at $70 a foot. He left a $10,000 deposit on her cabin table for first refusal on the sinker pine in the spring. By mid-December, winter had set its teeth into Colton County, freezing the ditches along Highway 4 and carrying the hard metallic smell of impending snow. In his corner office above the commercial distribution yard, Garrett Whitlock stared at 3 legal notices laid across his mahogany desk, his corporate books collapsing under 5 years of aggressive short-term leverage. He had taken out 4 commercial mortgages on the Highway 4 real estate to finance a fleet of 18-wheelers and to purchase 3,000 tons of cheap plantation-grown pine lumber from southern Georgia. That lumber had been harvested too young and dried too fast in gas-fired kilns. When autumn rains hit Colton County in October, 60% of Garrett's inventory sitting in open yards began to twist, cup, and split. Two of his largest subdivision contractors in Murfreesboro rejected 4 truckloads of framing timber, canceled their seasonal contracts, and filed a formal complaint with the state licensing board for structural defects. Simultaneously, Colton National Bank issued a margin call on Vance's $3 million in leveraged technology equities after a 12% market drop, freezing Vance's checking account to cover the personal guarantees he had signed on Garrett's equipment loans. Vance walked into Garrett's office with sleet on his leather jacket and a gray, hollow look around his eyes, slapping a copy of the Colton County Gazette onto the desk. Below the fold on the front page ran a photograph of Clara Whitlock, Hank Mercer, and Cyrus Miller standing on the loading dock of the old river mill, beside a strapped bundle of iridescent black walnut planks being loaded into a Nashville transport van. The article detailed how Clara had restored her family's 1891 steam sawmill and opened an underground limestone curing vault containing 70,000 board feet of 19th-century sinker timber, valued by commercial buyers at better than $4 million on the artisan market. Garrett read the valuation 3 times, his face turning the color of cold tallow, as he gripped the edge of his desk and raged that their father had left them the sign and the house while leaving Clara $4 million of walnut in a mud hole. He insisted that an 86-year-old man on oxygen was not of sound disposing mind when he signed the deed. He declared that the timber had been harvested by Whitlock lumber crews in the 1880s and belonged to the corporation as salvage inventory, and vowed to enforce an immediate stop work order. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Garrett's leased black Cadillac Escalade came pounding down the gravel river trail, sliding to a gravel scattering halt in the middle of the mill clearing. The scene they encountered was not a lonely, defenseless shack, but a working mill with smoke rising from the 40-foot brick chimney, and 3 young men from High Bridge stacking 3-inch heart pine planks onto a flatbed trailer under Cyrus Miller's watchful eye. Clara sat on the front porch of the cabin, with her arms folded across her barn coat, flanked by Hank Mercer, holding a 30-inch hickory cant hook, and Mabel Gentry, leaning against the doorframe with a coffee mug, while Barnaby sat at Clara's boot, with his yellow eyes locked onto the intruders. Garrett marched across the clearing in his dress shoes and shouted for Clara to shut the steam engine down, pointing toward the loading dock and demanding she cease selling corporate salvage inventory. Without a board resolution, Clara looked down from the top step with a calm, unreadable expression and told Garrett he was trespassing on private property. When Garrett threatened to file an emergency injunction in district court the next morning to challenge their father's competency, Hank Mercer stepped forward with his cant hook resting against his shoulder. He reminded Garrett that in 1885, the mill was owned by Arthur's grandfather as an individual sole proprietorship, whereas Garrett's Highway Corporation was not chartered until 1952 and had never owned a square inch of parcel 14. Before Garrett could answer, an old 1991 Buick Century and a white Colton County Sheriff's Department patrol SUV pulled into the clearing behind the Cadillac. Walter Webb stepped out of the Buick, carrying a thick black leather briefcase, accompanied by Sheriff Thomas Largent, a 55-year-old local whose father had bought roof rafters from Arthur Whitlock in 1962. Webb walked between Garrett and the porch steps, explaining that he had seen Garrett's Cadillac speeding past the bank and had asked the sheriff to ride along. When Garrett loudly insisted that the will would not stand up in court, Webb opened his briefcase and produced a plastic sleeve document bound with blue legal tape. It contained sworn affidavits from 2 independent clinical neurologists at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, who had examined Arthur 3 days before he signed his will and certified his cognitive function in the 95th percentile for his age. Webb then produced a bound transcript of a 2-hour video deposition Arthur had recorded in his office that same afternoon. In it, Arthur detailed every mortgage Garrett had taken out on the Highway 4 yard and stated, for the permanent record, that he was leaving Garrett the commercial yard to see if he had the spine to pay off his own debts. Webb turned his cold gray eyes onto Vance and added that Arthur had recorded the serial numbers of every Series E bond and the survey coordinates of every sinker log in his personal tax filings every year since 1981, paying personal property tax on the logs as salvaged timber for 40 years, so that Whitlock Commercial Lumber had no claim to the wood. Webb closed his briefcase and informed Garrett that Colton National Bank had filed a formal notice of default on his equipment loans at 10 o'clock that morning. He advised both brothers to return to Highway 4 to meet the receivers before Sheriff Largent lodged them in the county jail for criminal trespass. Sheriff Largent did not raise his voice or draw his weapon, but took one step toward the Cadillac and noted that the road was getting slick with sleet. Stripped of 20 years of corporate arrogance, Garrett stood silent for 5 seconds before turning back to the Cadillac with Vance, driving away up the river trail until their taillights disappeared into the gray November timber. By 5 o'clock, the drizzle had stopped, leaving the valley washed clean and smelling of cold limestone and hickory smoke as the High Bridge boys finished loading the trailer, and Walter Webb and Sheriff Largent drove back to town with a jar of Mabel's apple butter. Clara sat on the top step of the cabin porch in dry wool socks, with a mug of black coffee between her palms, while Barnaby rested his gray muzzle on her knee, his upright ear twitching toward the call of a barred owl across the river. In the clearing below, the great oak doors of the kiln house stood open to cool the Atlas steam engine, while Hank Mercer and Cyrus Miller sat on a timber bench by the firebox, sharing a thermos of sweet tea and debating governor valves in low, contented voices. Clara touched the 4-inch brass key resting against her collarbone and remembered her father telling her 30 years earlier that while some men leave their children houses that need new roofs or paper numbers that blow away in bank drafts, an honest inheritance is a piece of work you use your hands to understand. Surrounded by neighbors who know the weight of a cord of wood. Looking across the clearing toward the loading dock, she knew she would never sell the 60 acres, build a mansion on Ridge Road, or buy a fleet of trucks with her name painted on the doors. She would keep the chimney smoking, raising 3 sinker logs a summer to keep the engine oiled, the High Bridge boys employed, and the luthiers supplied with wood that made music sound like it came from an older, kinder world. As the sun dropped below the western ridge and turned the Blackwater River the color of dark rye whiskey, Clara opened the cabin door, where the hickory fire threw its warm golden light across the scrubbed chestnut floorboards. She called Barnaby inside for his supper, while the great brick chimney of the Whitlock mill sent one last level plume of sweet smoke rising straight up into the cold mountain stars, standing firm, standing tall, and standing ready for the morning. Sometimes the world tries to measure your worth by the car in your driveway or the numbers in a ledger. The numbers in a ledger. It forgets that the real wealth of this country was built by men and women who knew how to work with their hands, who kept their promises in the dark, and who never forgot the value of what was sleeping in the river silt. If Clara's story reminded you of the quiet strength of the people who raised us, and if you believe that an honest legacy is worth more than all the flashy wealth in the world, hit that subscribe button right now, give this video a like, and share it with someone who remembers what real craftsmanship looks like. Leave a comment below and tell us what is the most valuable piece of wisdom your father or grandfather ever left to you. We read every single one of your stories, and we thank you for welcoming us into your home tonight. Until next time, keep the fire banked, keep your neighbors close, and remember, the best things in this life are the ones built to last.